Well, it's great to have all of you with us today. My name is Chris. I'm one of the pastors here, and we're in this series titled An Unexpected Christmas. And if God would have come to me and said, write the Christmas story, not the Christmas story that we know of now, but he said, blank page, just write the Christmas story, what you think it should read like. I promise you, none of us would have scripted the Christmas story like we know it today. I mean, at every twist and turn, there's these unexpected moments that, again, we would just have never included in the Christmas story. And I'm not talking the Christmas story that usually, that we tell. I mean, the Christmas story about Jesus and a manger in Bethlehem part of the story. No, the entire Christmas story leading up to Jesus coming to this earth. You see, Matthew understood that the Christmas story started so much before where we usually tell the Christmas story. And that's why Matthew, when he started out telling the Christmas story, he said, this is a genealogy of Jesus. Now, for you and I, in our modern day culture, we don't have a huge value on our genealogy. It intrigues us, right? It's intriguing, and maybe you spent some time, Googling your family tree. Maybe you've gone on Ancestry.com. There's some intrigue there, but that's kind of where we leave it. And probably, if you're like me, all the intrigue is about trying to find that one really, really cool person in your family line that you can claim as royalty, right? We just hope that 800 years ago, there was some king of some mountain, and you're like, yes, I'm royalty. At least that's my pursuit. But in ancient times, genealogy was everything. I mean, I can't highlight the significance of a person's lineage and what they placed on, where they came from, and who they were because of where they came from. And what was next in their family line. And that's why Matthew started here. I mean, we think that's odd, but for Matthew, again, lineage, genealogy was everything. And so Matthew started the Christmas story, and he says, this is a genealogy of Jesus. And he started with Abraham, Father Abraham. And last week in part 1, we landed on looking at the story of Judah and Tamar. Out of the 12 sons of Jacob that became the 12 tribes, which became Israel, God chose Judah, not Joseph. Again, if you and I were writing the Christmas story, we would have chosen Joseph, a man of character, a man of integrity, a man who was a great leader, a man that no matter the circumstances kept his faith in God, a man that rose up into Pharaoh's ranks and did great things for the land, the man that extended forgiveness to his family. We would choose Joseph, but God chose Judah. And we landed on this truth, that God qualifies the unqualified. I mean, have you ever felt like you're just not good enough for God? Have you ever felt like the scandal in your past, it's just tainted you forever, that there's just no way God would ever love you or accept you? Is that what's kept you away from church? Going, I just feel so guilty from the storyline of my past. And maybe it's just not you directly. Maybe you look at your parents or your grandparents and it's just a mess. And you're like, there's just no way. God's way up here and I'm way down here. And part of the Christmas story, God wanted to highlight that he qualifies the unqualified. Every year, my family, we do Advent together. And it's been a really kind of a special part of our family Christmas journey. And we've done it in different ways. But the last 5 or 6 years, we have this magnetic kind of board. And on that board are all these little round metal containers. And they're all numbered, for the days of December. And every year, we kind of change it up. But we print out these little pieces of paper that we put in these metal containers. And on these pieces of paper, there's kind of 2 components. The first component is the fun component. Like, they get to do something. There's an action for that day. One of the days is they get hot chocolate with extra whipped cream. They love that one. One of them is, as a family, we're going to watch all the Christmas claymation movies and eat popcorn. They love that one. One of them is go buy a present for someone that needs to have a Christmas present. Another one is to write a Christmas letter to a soldier overseas. It's just every day is filled with different kind of actions, and so they look forward to that. But also at the bottom of these little pieces of paper are different Bible verses, part of the Christmas story. And this last week, our girls read this verse from Genesis chapter 15. And Abraham believed the Lord, and the Lord counted him as righteous, meaning right before a holy, perfect, good God, because of his faith. And I paused when they read those words, and I said to my girls, I said, hey, girls, Abraham was righteous because of his actions. And they're like, no, Dad, faith. Okay, Abraham was righteous because he prayed every day. No, Dad, it was faith. Okay, Abraham was righteous because he went to church every weekend. No, Dad, faith. Abraham was righteous because he gave generously. No, Dad, faith. And I'm like, girls, you got to hold on to that. I mean, all those other things are good things. Doing good things, saying good things, going to church, praying, giving generously. Those are all good things. Those are going to shape your heart. And at the end, God's after our hearts. All those are good things. But Abraham wasn't righteous because of what he did, but because of who he trusted, who he had faith in. None of us are good enough. All of us are unqualified. And the beautiful part of the Christmas story is that God qualifies the unqualified. Well, Matthew continues on in this genealogy, and he writes, Hezron, the father of Ram, Ram, the father of the father of Nahshon, Nahshon, the father of Solomon. I nailed that name, by the way. Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, and Rahab was a prostitute who hid the spies in Jericho. And after Israel conquered Jericho, she marries Solomon, and together they have a boy named Boaz. And Boaz is going to be one of the central characters of the Christmas story. But before we get to that story, let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt like an outsider? Have you ever had that moment where you walked into a group of people and you just screamed that you were not part of that group? Have you ever moved to a town, and when you moved to the town, everyone talked about you, but no one talked to you? Have you ever found yourself getting a new job, and as you go to get a new job, it's lunchtime and everyone's leaving to go get lunch and you're left sitting at your desk by yourself? Have you ever walked into a cafeteria type of space and everyone has their assigned seats? I mean, they're not really assigned seats, but they've been there the longest. So they sit at their table, at their chair, and you found yourself all by yourself. Have you ever felt like an outsider? And probably the answer to that question is yes, you have. I was at a gathering of pastors last week in Atlanta. And out of the 80, 90 or so pastors that were all kind of invited to gather together, I knew one person. At the core, I am an introvert. And that always shocks people because they see me speak in front of all these people and like, no, Chris isn't. He's an extrovert. I'm like, no, this is the safest place for an introvert, at least for me as an introvert to be. And I was headed to Atlanta, and I felt so much anxiety, and I've worked through this over the years. I've gotten so much better. I get to my hotel, I get things unpacked, and it was coming to the time where we were all going to gather together. I got outside the elevator, I had my phone, my heart's racing. I'm like, okay, Chris, it's game time. You got to walk into this room, and you don't know anyone. You're going to walk in, put on your game face, and just get to know people. I'm like, I don't want to. The elevator opened up, I walked into this room, and for the next 2.5 days, I got to know a whole bunch of incredible people. But it took everything out of me. And for all of us, we kind of know what that feeling, whether you're introverted, extroverted, it doesn't matter, you know that feeling. And here's what happens, all of us. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, we shove people outside of our little circle and make them outsiders. We do this all the time. Most times, we're just not ever aware of it because we're experts of categorizing people, aren't we? Like you walk through a store and you just slap labels on people in different social economic groups. Election cycles come and you slap labels on people depending on their political ideology. I mean, it's football season, and whoever you root for, whatever fan you are, I mean, we just slap labels on people. I mean, like if you walk up and you find out that someone's a Patriots fan, you slap a label on that person, right? We do it all, right? We do it all the time. And even for some of you, you're like, yeah, and I hate that about our society. I hate that we label people. And here's the truth. And this, again, I'm pretty sure this applies to all of us. People who rail against labeling people slap labels on people that label people. You follow that, right? But isn't that true? People and you and I are people who rail against labeling people. Like, I'm anti-labeling people. We shouldn't label anyone. Slap labels on people who label people. We're just experts. And as soon as you slap a label on someone, you make them an outsider. And this part of the Christmas story is all about the outsiders and what God had to say about that. Well, there's three main characters in this story today. Boaz, who we were just introduced to, remember his dad Solomon, his mother's Rahab the prostitute. Another lady named Naomi, who we're going to interact with at the very beginning of the story. And then a gal named Ruth. And what's interesting about this story, it's actually a book of the Bible. It has 4 chapters in it. Out of all of 3 of these main characters, for some reason, and I think I know why, for some reason, the name of this book was after Ruth. It's not titled Boaz, and it's not titled Naomi. And I think the reason it was named after Ruth was actually the exact point of this story. Well, the story starts off in epic forms. The very first line of the story starts like this: in the days when the judges ruled and there was famine in the land. Can you feel the tension? Right? Every great story has tension built into it. Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer, right? The tension was all around his shiny nose, right? Frosty the snowman, it was all around him melting, right? It's like, oh no, Frosty's going to go away. The Christmas story was all around the Red Ryder BB gun. No, you might shoot your, right? Like the tension, right? And the leg lamp, but you're right, the tension, right? And you can just feel it here, right? It was a period of Israel where Israel wanted a king, and God kept on saying, you don't want a king because kings do what kings do. Kings raise taxes. Kings spends your money. Kings raise up armies that are made up of your sons to take your sons to war where they might die. Kings leverage their position and their power for their advantage. And God's like, you don't want a king. So God provided Israel with judges to help rule this brand new nation. And a severe famine hit the land. And in ancient times, life was connected to, could you raise crops to either eat those crops yourself or to feed your livestock, or a combination of both. Famine was everything. When famines came, you had one pursuit. How are you going to live? And so we get introduced to this family. We have Naomi here and her husband Elimelech, and they had 2 sons. And when this severe famine hit the land, they were living in Bethlehem, a town that we're familiar with, especially this Christmas season. And they realized that they had to do something drastic. So they made the decision to move to Moab. Now, again, we have to understand the significance of this decision, because the significance of this decision reflects on about how bad the famine was. And to understand Moab and why this was so significant, we have to understand the genealogy. And remember, I can't state how important genealogies were in ancient times. You see, Moab was a land where the Moabites lived. And when you trace the Moabite genealogy, it goes all the way back to Lot. Maybe you're familiar with Lot. Lot had a very famous uncle. His name was Abraham. And Lot also is connected to another story in the Bible about Sodom and Gomorrah. God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. They're leaving town. Lot's wife looks back. She gets turned to a pillar of salt. That's a bad moment. And he finds himself in a cave with his 2 daughters. And his 2 daughters come up with a pretty scandalous plan. Their plan was, let's get dad drunk and let's sleep with him so we can have kids. So they do. And one of the daughters has a son by her dad. And she named him Moab, which means from my father. And from that came the Moabites. And when you think through the lenses that genealogy is everything, could you imagine what the Israelites thought of the Moabites, that their whole lineage goes back to that moment, that decision, that interaction. You talk about scandalous. But the famine was so severe, they moved to Moab just to survive. They get there, and over time, Elimelech dies. We're not sure how he dies, but he dies. And Naomi, being a woman, I mean, this would be a very bad situation, but she still has 2 sons, and so those 2 sons could help protect and provide for her. Remember, I mean, in ancient times, if you were a woman, I mean, it was a difficult time unless you had a man there to provide for you and protect you. Again, in our day and age, that sounds, it's just so weird for me to even say, but in ancient times, it was everything. But Naomi was okay because she had 2 sons to provide and protect for her. They got married to 2 Moabite women. One was Ruth, and the other one, no, I didn't have a typo here. It's Orpah, not Oprah. 2 different people. Well, then both of her sons dies. You talk about having a difficult life journey. And Naomi, living in Moab, realizes that she's in a bad place. Her husband's gone, both of her sons are gone, and who's going to help protect and provide for her? So Naomi decides to go back to her hometown in Israel, Bethlehem. And Naomi looks at Ruth and Orpah and say, you guys need to stay here in Moab, your home country. You need to go back to your parents' house where they can protect you, where they can provide for you, and you need to find 2 great Moabite men to marry so your life will be that much easier. But Ruth and Orpah both say to Naomi, no, we're coming with you. And Naomi's like, no, stay here. Stay where it's going to be easy. Stay where you're going to be safe. Stay where you can marry someone. And they're both, no, Naomi, we're going with you. Naomi's like, no, stay. No, we're going to go. No, stay. They go back and forth. And finally, Orpah decides to stay in Moab. But Ruth looks at Naomi and says some of the most beautiful words. She said, where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And you have to ask the question. I mean, Ruth was willing to give up everything, the safety of her homeland, her family, but more than that, she was leaving her entire faith construct, because in Moab, they worship many different gods and goddesses. And Ruth is saying, no. Not only, Naomi, am I all in with you. I want you to know, not only am I all in with you, but that your God is my God. And you have to ask the question, well, how did Ruth get there? I mean, living in Moab, where there's a completely different religious faith construct. Well, you have to look at Naomi and Naomi's faith. I think the reality is, Ruth saw Naomi's faith in God. And it wasn't an internal thing that she saw. Oh, it was so much more. You see, the story God is scripting inside of you and is reflecting outside of you is magnetic to those around you. It's why every weekend we tell story after story after story of what God is doing within people that's reflecting outside of them, that becomes so magnetic to other people. It's why when you want to hold on to your story and say, my spiritual journey is my journey. No, it's not. Because that storyline that God is scripting within you must reflect outside of you. And when it reflects outside of you, when you tell your story, what God is doing within you, even in the hard seasons, you think about Naomi's seasons, leaving everything, loses a husband, 2 sons, in a land where she isn't protected and she's alone. But there was something within her that was so powerful, that became so magnetic, that Ruth said, I'm all in with you. I'm all in with you. And your God, be my God. So Ruth And Naomi head back to Bethlehem. Now, Naomi's name means pleasant. But something happened when they rolled into town. I mean, Naomi had been gone for 15, 20 plus years. It's been a long time. And she rolled into town and she started looking at people that she had grown up with, people that she had done life with, people that she had celebrated birthdays with, people that she had said goodbye to. And when she said goodbye to them, she had a husband and 2 sons. And now she's coming back into town. And it was one of those moments where all of a sudden her entire life flashed before her eyes. Have you had one of those moments where you look back and you had a clear picture of what you thought your life was going to look like, and all of a sudden there's this moment where you look back and you go, yeah, I didn't plan any of that. And Naomi had one of those moments. It was like her entire life came crashing in, going, like, when we left here, I never would have thought that my next 15, 20 years would have looked like this. And in a moment of just overwhelming grief, she said, I'm going to change my name to Mara, which means bitter. And at the close of chapter 1, hope has all but dissipated. Something interesting happens. I mean, there is this moment. I mean, Naomi is having a bad moment. So much so she wants to change her name. But in the rest of the story of Ruth, the author, well, they never referred to Naomi as Mara. It just goes back to Naomi. And what's so encouraging about this is so many times people feel like they can't have a bad moment or a bad season. So many times people feel like, well, if I was a good Christ follower, I would be able to handle everything coming my way. I'm pretty sure there's life moments that are way too heavy for any of us to carry by ourselves. There's life moments that are so overwhelming. And the reality of her life didn't even come close to what she had anticipated her life to look like. And now she comes back home without her husband and without her sons. But she didn't stay there. So chapter 2 begins. Instead of just wallowing in her self-pity, wallowing in the reality that she's a widow, she's by herself, she's lost her sons, instead of just being drugged back to her past, she realized that they had to face reality. And the reality was, she's a widow, Ruth is a widow, and they had to find a way to survive because they didn't have anyone to provide for them or protect them. It happened to be the barley harvest, and part of Jewish Israelite law, there was this law around harvest time. It was all around reaping and gleaning. And the law stated simply this, that if you were a landowner and it was harvest time, that you could not harvest the rows on the outside of your farm, that you could only make one pass down the rows of your farm, and that anything that would fall on the ground you could not pick up. And all of those laws were in place to help people who were destitute, to help people who were poor, and to help widows who didn't have anyone to provide or protect for them. And so the law was clear, and so it was harvest time, and what Naomi realized was like this was an opportunity for them, well, to go get food. So Ruth, this Moabite, who's not familiar with all the Israelite laws and customs, I'm sure Naomi told her about this, and so Ruth finds herself in the fields gleaning. And you have to think, like, there's these moments where she's in this field thinking to herself, I could have stayed in Moab. I could have moved back with my family. I could have found a husband. And now she's this outsider in this Jewish man's field that she doesn't know, just picking up crumbs from the field so they could survive. Well, as the day rolled on, the owner of the field showed up. And the owner of the field, well, his name is Boaz. Boaz shows up, and he's just looking over all the workers in the field and the people gleaning. He starts asking questions from one of his workers just about the people in the fields. And they get to Ruth, and Boaz is told the story about Ruth, because Ruth had to stand out because she was a Moabite. She was an outsider. And all of a sudden, Boaz is like, who's that? And he gets told the story about Ruth, who was married, and her husband died, and she chose to go back with Naomi, who's an Israelite, and she chose to come back, to leave her homeland. And Boaz, it just moves within him. And he says, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Think about the gravity of that statement. Boaz, an Israelite, looking at Ruth, a Moabite, saying, man, there's a reward coming your way because you've chosen to take refuge underneath the wings of God. Ruth, you're not an outsider. You're underneath the wings of God. You're connected to God. But not only did Boaz say such a nice thing, he showed incredible, incredible generosity. He looked at all of his workers and instructed them to as they're harvesting, to just not drop the crumbs, but actually drop sheaves on the ground, to drop extra on the ground. He instructed Ruth, hey, go pick up as much as you can. And as she got done with that day of gleaning, she had 30 pounds that she had picked up. And this was significant. And usually when you're gleaning, you just had enough for a few days of food. But she went home with 30 pounds. And not only did he instruct his workers to drop extra grain on the ground, he looked at Ruth and invited Ruth to eat at his table. The table that was reserved for his best workers, his highest associates. He brought in this Moabite to sit at his table and told her, eat your fill. And when she was done eating her fill, he gave her extra to take home. You talk about generosity that he lavished over this outsider. Wow. And Ruth went home to Naomi. Naomi asked her a simple question. She goes, where did you glean today? Where did you work? And Ruth started to tell the story about this generous landowner named Boaz. And all of a sudden, Naomi erupts. And she says, Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. Now again, this is so hard for us to grasp in our day and age, in our culture. But in the ancient times in Israel, this is a Jewish law. That this law about the kinsman redeemer. And it was all about helping provide for a widow that, she loses her husband and now she finds herself not protected, not provided for. And so there's this Jewish law that said if there's someone down the lineage, remember the lineage, the genealogy was so important. If they were willing that they could become the kinsman redeemer and marry the widow, pay off the debt for the land, to bring the land into the family and to keep the family lineage moving forward. And Naomi realizes that Boaz, down the family line, was part of their family genealogy, and that he could be their redeemer. And as chapter 1 ended with hope dissipating, chapter 2 ends with hope surging. And so Naomi lays out this plan, this strategy. Of course, Ruth, being a Moabite, she has no idea about Israel law and customs. And so she's learning this for the first time herself, going, what's this thing about a kinsman redeemer? And Naomi tells her, basically, Ruth, you got to go to Boaz, this landowner, this wealthy guy, and basically say, will you marry me? And this had to be super awkward for Ruth, going, you want me to do what? So Ruth goes to Boaz. And Ruth says to Boaz, you're our kinsman redeemer. And could you imagine that moment, that pause? Ruth, a Moabite, has no idea how Boaz is going to respond to her. She has no idea what he's going to say. I mean, he might just kick her out. And Boaz looks at Ruth and says, this kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor, and now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. But then Boaz had a question. And chapter 3 comes to an end with a question that Boaz had to get answered. You see, the question for Boaz was he realized there's another relative that was actually closer in line, that would have first rights of refusal or acceptance. It's up to him. So Boaz goes to this relative and starts telling the story about Naomi, and she lost her husband, and they have land. So do you want to pay for the land, the debt, and do you want to bring her in? And of course, this relative's like, yeah, that's great, right? More land, more crops, right? This is. By the way, I can care for her. And then Boaz adds a twist to the story. He goes, by the way, there's a Moabite named Ruth. You would have to marry her. And this relative goes, nope, not going to do that. And I think Boaz got a smile on his face, and he goes to Ruth, and he goes, Ruth, I will be your kinsman redeemer. I will provide for and protect you and Naomi. In front of the witnesses of everyone in Bethlehem and the city elders, they came out and said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together build up the family of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in. And when they said these words, they had no idea how significant, little town of Bethlehem would be. Be famous in Bethlehem. And Matthew telling the Christmas story, a genealogy that probably almost all of us just skip over, but is so significant to the story of Jesus. Matthew writes, Solomon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, a prostitute. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Obed, the father of Jesse, and Jesse, the father of the mighty, the famous King David. You see, God does the unexpected in the lives of outsiders and the unqualified. And what's incredible about the Christmas story is we should expect God. We should expect God to do incredible things in the lives of people who feel like they're outsiders and people who feel unqualified. And maybe that's your story. You felt like you were on the outside of God, on the outside of church, on the outside of faith, on the outside of other Christians. Maybe for you, you just feel so unqualified. And I hope you know that the Christmas story is filled with people that feel like you feel, that have experienced what you've experienced, that have gone through scandal in their life, who have walked into places feeling so outcast, and that the Christmas story is all about Jesus coming for everyone. It's a Christmas story. Jesus invading this world for everyone. So let me ask you this question. Who do you know Who do you know? Maybe you've labeled them. Maybe you've labeled them as, well, yeah, they just don't believe in God. I'm not going to waste my time. Maybe you've labeled them, yeah, they're just not a church person. I've talked with them about it, but, they just don't want anything to do with church. Maybe you label them as, but, I just know that the divorce they've gone through and it's really nasty and what they've done or what she done and what he's done. And I'm just, it's just not the right timing. Maybe you label them because, just your personal interaction with them hasn't been great. And you're like, I'm not sure if I really want to bring them to church because people might see me sitting with that person, and that would be scandalous, right? Maybe you've labeled them. And maybe you've shoved them on the outside. And just maybe a simple invite is the act of love that you need to extend this Christmas season, because the Christmas story is about outsiders and the unqualified, people like you and people like me. Who do you need a hand and invite to say, just take a step? Because remember, the story God is scripting inside of you, and that story that's reflecting outside of you, is magnetic to those around you. Here in a moment, we're going to baptize some people. And baptism for us at Tri-County Church, it's an epic celebration, because it's all about the story that God has been scripting within someone that's now reflecting outside of them. And baptisms become so magnetic because it reflects God's story within people. And maybe for you, you've been putting off getting baptized. I just want to let you know, it's not too late. You can just get in line when everyone gets in line. You might be thinking to yourself, I didn't bring clothing. It's okay. Clothes dry. See, I just solved that problem. But maybe you just need to take that step. I'm thankful that we don't have a perfect Christmas story, but we have a Christmas story that reflects God's perfect heart.